everybody, my name is Jenny Ryan and I am the editor and digital publisher for Reading Australia. Welcome to the penultimate session of the 2022 Literature Symposium, which is going to be all about aliteracy and using Australian literature to foster more enthusiastic readers. I am coming to you from Gadigal land, and so pay my respects to the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this place we now call Sydney, and to their elders past and present. As this is a discussion about Australian stories, I also acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as Australia's first storytellers. Their histories and cultures have been passed down for tens of thousands of years, and in turn have shaped new fiction, memoir, poetry, and other creative works that make up our extraordinary literary landscape today. By way of a quick overview, Reading Australia is an initiative of the Copyright Agency. This is an Australian not-for-profit that collects licence fees and distributes copyright royalty payments for the reuse of text and images. Reading Australia sits within the Copyright Agency's Cultural Fund, which supports the writing, publishing, and visual arts sectors through grants and fellowships. Our goal is to make it easier for teachers to spread a love of Australian texts. So we provide quality and insightful teaching resources to help bring those texts into the classroom. We currently have 265 resources from foundation through to senior secondary, and we add around 20 more each year. The resources are written by experienced teachers in consultation with the Australian Literacy Educators Association and the Australian Association for the Teaching of English. These are full units of work that are mapped to the Australian curriculum and freely available for teachers, school librarians, and anyone else interested in teaching books by Australian writers. Through the Copyright Agency's Cultural Fund, we offer a $15,000 Reading Australia Fellowship for teachers of English and literacy. This is awarded annually to an experienced teacher or teacher librarian to undertake research in the field of English and literacy teaching. We have awarded 4 fellowships since 2019, one of which supported a project about aliteracy and Australian literature. Who better to unpack these concepts for us than the fellow who's been researching them? So, allow me to introduce her. Edwina West is an English teacher and coordinator of student and staff development at Oak Hill College in Castle Hill, New South Wales. In this role, she develops professional learning experiences for staff and enrichment experiences for students with high academic potential. She is greatly interested in the benefits of reading, not only for academic success, but also for personal and social development. This partly inspired her application for the Reading Australia Fellowship, which she was awarded in 2021. Edwina is currently on parental leave following the arrival of her first child, but she still managed to find time in her busy schedule for us. Edwina, welcome. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you for having me.
I have actually really been looking forward to this conversation because I've kind of had a bit of a sneak preview of your research already. You've done a few guest posts on our website and you appeared on our panel at the AAT ALIA National Conference in Darwin back in July. And I remember the people in that room being very engaged and very interested in what you were talking about. Have you found that people are having the same reaction in your own conversations?
Absolutely. Different people from different walks of life and different careers, authors, teachers, librarians, they're all really interested in what I'm looking at. They see that it's a big issue that needs to be solved and they're really excited to see what I've been looking into.
And I'm not surprised. I feel like it's a topic that has a lot of touch points far beyond just education as well, with book selling and publishing more broadly. Well, we're here to talk about aliteracy, so let's get stuck into it. I had actually never heard of this term before reading your application. So for anybody else who's watching who might also be unfamiliar with it, can you just explain what aliteracy actually is and why you were interested in researching it?
Aliteracy is the state of being able to read but not having the desire to do so. And it was first coined by Daniel Boorstin, who was the US Librarian of Congress in 1984. And he described aliteracy and illiteracy as the twin menaces of society, and I really like that. Really like that term. And I was interested to look into it out of my own experience, because I have seen in my own classrooms young people who just have no interest in reading. They're able to, but they just have no interest in doing it whatsoever. And I really thought that other teachers might be interested in that as well. From my conversations in staff rooms, it always seems to be an issue that young people aren't reading. So I thought there was a place for it.
Yeah, wow. 1984.
Yes,
That's quite a
I
while ago
know.
now, but and yet it still feels like it's a relatively new concept. But so then, if illiteracy rates continue to grow, what are the implications of that? What does that mean?
There are several implications. First of all, educationally, the research shows that if you are a recreational reader, your literacy rate is more likely to be higher. So we've all seen the press about Australia's slipping literacy rates, and that's a really bad thing, obviously. So if we improve recreational reading and reading for pleasure, then chances are the literacy rates of Australians will also rise. We also have a cultural issue, because books are not just for schooling, they also teach us so much about our culture, and it also teaches us so much about the world. So culturally, books and literature hold so much weight. In an earlier literature symposium, Dr. Bronwyn Bancroft said that the imaginative world informs the real world, and I really think that that is true. It's important because reading shapes the world we live in, and it is shaped from the world we live in as well, and I think that's really important. And then there's emotional and affective reasons why reading is really important as well. So studies have shown that people who read for pleasure or read for enjoyment are better at self-regulation and are also better at executive function. So that's a big issue for young people who are learning those skills. And one scientific study even found that reading novels improved brain connectivity in the areas for perspective taking, which means that reading makes you a more empathetic and better person.
Yeah, I was going to say, I remember reading an essay in the Griffith Review, I think, that was talking about early literacy and how, reading stories about people's experiences and worldviews that are different from yours was really important for building empathy. So that really resonates with stuff that's already out there about the importance of reading. So then, okay, that's quite important. Do we then know what's actually stopping young people from going on to become enthusiastic adult readers?
It's a very complex problem. Time is often a factor that young people report. They feel overloaded with extracurricular activities and demands of study and the pressures to do well in high schooling. The rise of social media use, I'm sure, won't surprise you as being a factor that plays into having time to read. And I really think, obviously, that's a question of priorities there. Reduced rates in reading for adults doesn't help, because young readers are produced from homes that have adult readers in them. So a young person's more likely to read if they see their older people in their family reading. That really hit home for me. Earlier this year, I had my first baby, and in a New South Wales hospital, you get a bundle of things for the baby, and inside that bundle was a couple of books, 3 books, I think. And I don't know if this is true, but the nurse told me that the reason that they put the books in the bag was because they have seen that babies know how to swipe a phone, but they don't know how to open a book.
No.
And so that's part of the reason why they were in the bag, and that just really hit home for me. And I thought, okay, this fellowship is really important, and I'm so glad I applied.
Wow. I mean, that's quite shocking, but also how great that they're actually providing the books in New South
Yes.
Wales hospitals. That's
Yes.
great. I had no idea that was a thing that
Yeah.
happened. Wow, there you
Yeah, and
go.
you get a nice little goodie bag.
Wow. Okay, so that's what's stopping them from reading. What do we know about what they actually enjoy reading? And, amongst that, are they actually choosing to read any Australian literature?
So overwhelmingly, it's more about a good story than where the story is from. And it seems like Australian children or young people aren't really thinking about where their stories are coming from or where the books they read are coming from. The Civica list comes out every year, and it tells you the top 10 books that are borrowed from libraries around Australia. And the category for young adult, 8 of the 10 books were Diary of a Wimpy Kid. which I would question is even young adult to start with, but it's not Australian. I think there was one Australian book on that list.
One?
Yes. So in the top 10. The adult list was far more densely populated with Australian texts, which is great.
Oh, okay.
So, but not so much in the younger reading category. And in terms of genre, science fiction, fantasy, those kind of genres, very, very popular, which I'm sure doesn't surprise you. And in terms of form, young people definitely prefer reading in print rather than digitally.
Oh, how interesting.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking, I wonder about how, online, sort of fan fiction and Tumblr posts and those sorts of things. That was a little while ago. That seemed to be, quite trendy, but I guess that's kind of fallen out a little bit, which is interesting. And we were just talking earlier about the fact that, in high school, we weren't really exposed to much Australian literature at all. So I guess that it's still the case today that young people aren't being really exposed to it
Well, I think,
either.
or it's just not something that's really thought about. And when we're talking about reading for pleasure, so in terms of school prescriptions, you do need to have Australian texts in every year group, I believe, or every stage. It differs based on state. But just because there's one Australian book in year 8 doesn't mean doesn't mean you're going to pick up Australian books to read for pleasure. Yeah.
So then kind of following that thread about, Australian literature, why does it matter that young people read contemporary Australian literature? There's obviously so many fantastic international books as well available for young people, and they're also fantastic. But what is it that we think is important about Australian literature?
I think a few things. Firstly, I think it's really important because it helps young people see the nuance of Australian culture. So the humour, the language, all of that sort of stuff I think is really important. Secondly, I think every English teacher would love to see their students develop into writers professionally. That's a dream to know that you taught someone who became a published author. And if you encourage young people to read Australian texts, then they're going to see that being an author or a writer is a valid career in Australia and that they will be able to pursue that in Australia. So I think that's really important. I also think if we're talking about reluctant readers, what's more engaging for a young person than to see places or people that they recognise in the text that they're reading? So it could be, I think, a really great gateway for young people to find texts that they're drawn to because they see themselves and they see the world that they know, I think.
And I think as well that there's so much fantastic contemporary Australian literature being written and published today that young people can really see the world they live in now. It's not just about reading very old texts and Australian bush poetry and that kind of thing. There are so many wonderful modern stories like The Coconut Children or The Hate Race or The Year the Maps Changed. And those are also really instrumental in helping shape young people's perceptions of the world too.
Yes, and those texts have a place. And I'm not saying we shouldn't read them or we shouldn't offer them in our classrooms, but we need to maybe go beyond that to really show the Australia that exists today. And I think that will resonate with readers more.
Okay, so let's join these two threads of Aliteracy and Australian literature. Do you think Australian literature has a role to play in combating illiteracy? And if so, how do we actually get more of it into young people's hands?
So, like I sort of alluded to before, I think that Australian literature can be a great launching pad for reluctant readers. So, books that they see themselves in the world that they know in could be a great gateway into reading. The most important thing that the research shows about reading and getting young people to take up reading is offering them a good collection. So good quality texts that are age appropriate and thematically appropriate. So as a classroom teacher, I would always advocate working with your teacher librarian because they are the ones that know the collection that's available in your school and also what is available for them to build the collection of your school, if you're lucky enough to have a teacher librarian in your school, because they're so important. I think they're the centre of the school, in my opinion. I personally try to keep on top of what's coming out, and I find social media really helpful for that. So following publishers, following authors, and organisations like Reading Australia on social media really helps to find out what's coming out. Using Australian literature in our classrooms is important, and we were sort of talking about this before as well. I think if you're a classroom teacher and you're thinking about revamping some units, maybe you need to look at the text that you're doing and ask yourself, do they really serve my students anymore? Can any of the texts that I'm doing be replaced by more contemporary Australian texts that might engage my students more? Take a look at the Reading Australia collection of resources. There's so many to choose from, and that's a really great help. If you're writing the unit of work for your school, why not pick one that's already there and build upon that or use what's there. Also, reading aloud in the classroom, that in the research is shown to have a lot of impact, and I've spoken to authors who tour around Australia talking to schools, and they really speak to the power of reading aloud and how that engages the audience, even reluctant readers. And teacher librarians and teachers are saying the same thing to me when I speak to them. So I think that's important. And a final strategy I just wanted to mention is the power of the screen. So we all know young people spend a long time in front of screens, whether that is their phone, but also television and streaming services. So tapping into that, finding out what your students like watching and seeing what Australian texts out there that you could recommend to sort of supplement that interest or build upon that interest. So if you've got a young person in your classroom who loved watching Heartstopper or loved watching Never Have I Ever on Netflix, maybe you pick up a Sophie Gonzalez or a Tobias Madden text or Gary Lonsborough's Boy from the Mish, because that's the same kind of growing up teenage life that might engage them.
And it's really interesting what you said before about reading aloud, and that it's so effective, because that's really, another important thing in early childhood literacy too, is having the parent reading aloud. And that same Griffith Review essay I talked about before, it was saying it doesn't even matter if the parent is reading the words on the page. Like they could just be making up a completely different story. What mattered was the reading aloud. So it's quite interesting that that's still a strategy that's still effective at engaging people even as they get older throughout their lives.
Yes.
Wow. Okay, and we talked about teacher librarians. We love teacher librarians at Reading Australia as well. Speaking of them, who are the key people who can make a difference in this area? And maybe it's individuals like the teacher librarian, or maybe it's groups or sectors in Australia. Who are they? What role do they have to play? How can they work together to combat illiteracy?
Well, I think it's about relationships. I think it all boils down to relationships. And if we're talking about a young person who spends most of their year at school, we're talking about the relationship between the young person and their teacher. The teacher needs to know them, needs to know what they're interested in and their likes and dislikes, and try to put the right book into their hand. And that is about a partnership between the teacher and the teacher librarian as well. I think when I was thinking about this question, I was thinking about my own context. My school is going to be over 2,000 students next year. So our teacher librarians are amazing, but they can't know every child in that school personally. That's so many people. So in my opinion, needs to be a bit of a demarcation. As a classroom teacher, it's my job to know my student, and it's the teacher librarian who knows the collection. So if you're working together, you're going to be able to put the right book into the hand of the right student, in my opinion. Reading is a social practice, so young people are more likely to read if they can talk about what they're reading with their peers, for one. But I also think with family and with parents, it's important to talk about what they're reading and what they liked and what they didn't like. So having the teacher, the teacher librarian, and the parents all working together is what's going to make young people read more, I think.
Yeah, and also I think as we were kind of mentioned before, sort of booksellers and publishers, there might be a way into them as well. I think maybe this might have some broader implications beyond just the classroom as well. But we think if we're starting in the classroom, aren't we?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. Interesting as well what you said about the social. I mean, like, I guess that's why book talk is so, I mean, like, I'm very uncool. I don't have a TikTok, but from what I understand, book talk is like a great source of recommendations and just sort of social engagement around reading.
Well, book talk is interesting because it's fiercely followed, but really followed by avid readers, not really by reluctant
Interesting.
readers.
Okay.
So I think that just going back to basics and having conversation is maybe where we need to tap into the reluctant readers.
Okay. And so, I mean, there's just so much. There's so much in this topic. And I guess you're fairly advanced through your project at this point. I do understand that you are hoping to create some resources and maybe that there's some you found along the way. I think someone commented on our Facebook page saying, oh, where's the resources? So people are keen to know. Can you tell us about what you're working on or things that you found that might also be useful to share with people?
Yes. So when I started this project, I did some reading and I read the work of Dr. Margaret Merger, and she spoke about choosing strategies and how one way to improve the reading of reluctant readers is to explicitly teach them how to choose a book that interests them. So that is one of the places that I started this project, and I thought, well, why not create and seek out choosing strategies that I can build together, create discrete lessons, and make a website where teachers can access those lessons whenever they like. So that's what I've been working on, and I intend to have that ready for the new school year. So that will all be ready to roll out at the beginning of the year.
Exciting.
And they are going to be linked to the general capabilities of the Australian curriculum, and there'll be discrete lessons, like I said, that teachers can just pick up and use in a one lesson. I'm also looking at creating a list of Australian texts and thinking about aligning them to common American or British texts or texts from overseas that are taught in schools. So maybe a bit of, instead of this, try this.
Yeah, that's cool.
I thought that would be helpful to teachers. And I also would like to make a list of general strategies of things that I have researched that seem to improve the reading culture of a school, because I think that will be helpful. Maybe a top 10 or a top 20 things that a school can relatively easily implement to improve the reading rates of their school. But I found so many resources, like you said, from other organisations. So I'd really like to highlight those if I can.
Please do.
I went down to Canberra in July and I went to the National Centre for Australian Children's Literature, and I was shown around by the lovely Belle Alderman, and she showed me all of the archives there, and that was really cool, and I nerded out at that. But what she showed me is they have databases of texts that have been curated, Australian texts. So they have a cultural diversity database and an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander resource. So if you go to the website, you'll be able to see they have hundreds and hundreds of texts that have been curated. They have Australian curriculum links. They have annotations made by experts and even links to additional teaching resources.
Amazing.
That's something I didn't know about before. They also have an Australian verse novel resource, which I thought was really interesting. I think the verse novel is something that's really underutilised in schools. A great thing for a reluctant reader because it's so much more digestible, more easily digestible than a full prose novel. And they also have a database of picture books for older readers coming out as well.
Nice.
So I highly recommend looking at that. Yeah. Also, there's Love Oz YA, which I'm sure you've heard about. So they're very, very strong on social media. They have posters available on their website, which sort of theme Australian texts or contemporary Australian texts.
I've seen them. They're beautiful.
Yeah, they're very, very good. And I was actually thinking about making something like that, but they've already done it. So I'm not gonna do anything because they've done it so well. Yeah. And another thing that they have that I didn't know about. Last week, I watched the National Young Writers Festival talk, the Love Oz YA talk, and I didn't know they had a service called the Book Detective where you can write in and say, I want a book with X, Y, and Z in it, and someone will find you that book
Wow.
Yes. So I thought that was really fun. So I would highly recommend that. So maybe if you've got a young reader who's just can't find what they're looking for, get them to write into the book detective and maybe they'll find something.
Wow.
Yeah.
Imagine being able to put that on your resume. I'm the book detective.
Yeah, I know. I love that.
Sorry, you were saying?
I have one other. Children's Books Daily, the website, which
Yes.
you might know, Megan Daly's website. She has a great podcast called Your Kids Next Read. I think there are something like 70 episodes or something. So I thought that would be really great for teachers who are time poor, who might want to listen to it on the way to and from work.
Love a good podcast.
And she also has a book as well, Raising Readers, which is a great read.
Fantastic. I'm actually just going to circle back because I realized I got so excited to ask about the resources that I skipped another question, and you have kind of answered this a little bit already. But going back and thinking about sort of the intersection between using Australian literature to combat illiteracy, what can we give young people to actually help cultivate their enthusiasm? You've talked about the resources and the choosing strategies. Was there anything else in terms of like content or like teachable skills and tools that we haven't covered off yet that you think is important to note?
Apart from making sure quality texts are always available to them, I think having the vocabulary around reading is really important. I've found that sometimes a young person can't even articulate to me what they like to read, or why they liked something, or more likely why they didn't like something. So I think explicitly teaching that language, I guess it's the language of cause and effect, and the language of explanation. I think that's really important to explicitly teach, so that we are better able to put a book in their hand that they're going to enjoy because we understand their reasoning about why they did or didn't like something.
I remember you told a story at the conference in Darwin about talking to a student who was just reading, I can't remember the book, but you were like, oh, why did you choose that? And they were like, I don't know, like someone told me to read this one,
Yes.
so that's what I read.
It was just this mindless picking up of the book and reading it. It was Catch-22.
Oh, that's
So,
right.
you know, that's a heavy read.
Yeah.
So he just, and I told the story at the conference, but he's a really bright boy, an A student, still a non-reader in English. In English he's get A's, but he's still not a non-reader. So that sort of mindless picking up of something because I'm told I have to because it's a wide reading lesson. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure that those resources you're creating, like the website, and those actual lesson plans, they'll be fantastic to help actually teachers start tackling this area. We're kind of getting towards the end of our discussion. So Edwina, what is next for you? Is there anything that you still want to draw out of your fellowship that you haven't quite gotten around to yet? Are there any more offshoots that you found that you want to pursue? Like what can we expect now?
Still have a few things left to do. The pandemic sort of slowed down the start of the project.
Oh, that thing.
That old thing. But I am going to hopefully present at the Ali conference next year. That's my plan.
In Canberra.
And yes, in Canberra. And I am also hoping to do a little bit of writing for some of the English teacher organisations around. So I'm working on that as well.
Fabulous. That all sounds terrific. I'm very excited to see the final results of your report and all those resources. And I know a lot of other people are going to be very interested in seeing those as well. Edwina, thank you so much for your time today. If people are interested in keeping up to date with you, what you're doing, is there anywhere that they can find you or follow you?
My Instagram handle is @edwina.reads. That's the best place. I'm, despite my best efforts, not a very good Twitterer. So there is a Twitter, but I don't use it.
No problem. So Instagram's the best
That's
place.
the best
Fantastic. And I'm sure that once you've got that website, we will be able to share that through Reading
Yes,
Australia as well.
absolutely.
We'll make sure we'll put it on the website. We'll share it through our EDMs. We'll do everything to help spread the word for you.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Edwina.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you to everyone for tuning in for this discussion. We're almost at the end of our very first Literature Symposium. The final session, led by our friends at the National Centre for Australian Children's Literature, goes live on the 30th of November. Until then, if you'd like to catch up on any of the previous sessions, you can find them all in a playlist on the Symposium website. Also keep an eye on your emails for a short survey in the days following the final session. This will go out to everyone who registered for the symposium through Humanitics. It should only take a few minutes and will help the organisers to know what worked well and where we can improve. So don't be shy with your feedback. A special thanks to the Foundation for Learning and Literacy for organising this year's symposium. It's been a pleasure working with so many passionate organisations to champion the power and pleasure of literature and literacy. If you'd like to keep up with Reading Australia, you can visit readingaustralia.com.au to explore our resources or sign up for our free newsletter, which delivers the latest units of work straight to your inbox every 6 to 8 weeks. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you again for joining us. Stay well wherever you are, and happy reading.